The funeral was in Luxembourg, not where anyone expected it, not Arlington, not a church in California, not the grand ceremonial precincts that a general of Patton's standing might have been expected to occupy at the end. He was buried at the American Military Cemetery at Hamm, in a plot he reportedly chose because it was with the men of the Third Army, and the men of the Third Army were buried in Luxembourg, and he had said at some point that he wanted to be where they were. The men who had died in the campaign he commanded, the ones he had saluted from the roadside and written to their mothers and tried to name when the grave said unknown. He was buried with them. The ceremony in December of 1945 was what military funerals are: formal, measured, governed by the protocol that rank and occasion require. The generals were there, the American generals who had served with him and the Allied officers who had known him in the European theater. There were dignitaries. There was the apparatus of ceremony that a three-star general's death produces. And there was, at the head of the grave, closer to Patton than anyone else standing at that burial in the December cold of Luxembourg, a man who was not a general. He had been Patton's personal sergeant for 8 years. If you want more untold stories from World War II, hit that subscribe button. Let me back up a second, because to understand what it means that Master Sergeant William Carter stood closest at that funeral, you need to understand what 8 years of personal service to a man like Patton actually contains. A general's personal orderly occupies a specific and rarely described position in the architecture of military life. He is not the aide-de-camp, who manages the administrative and ceremonial dimensions of command. He is not the driver, who moves the general through the operational landscape. He is not the staff officer, who engages the general's mind on the problems of command. He is the man who attends to the body itself, to the uniform that needs to be perfect before the general appears, to the boots that need to be polished to the standard Patton's boots required, to the sleeping arrangements and the meal requirements, and the 1,000 small physical necessities of a man who is simultaneously one of the most observed people in the American military, and a human being who sometimes could not find his own socks. The orderly lives at the boundary of the general's public self and his private one. He is present in the rooms that no one else enters. He is there in the early mornings before the command persona is fully assembled, and he is there in the late nights after it has been set aside. He knows the general's moods by signs that no one else can read, the particular quality of a silence, the set of the jaw that means something specific, the habit of hand that indicates the thinking is going well or badly. He knows these things because he has been watching every day for 8 years, and the watching has made him fluent in a language that has only one speaker. What William Carter knew about George Patton was not what the generals knew. It was not what Eisenhower knew, or Bradley, or Montgomery, or the staff officers who had observed Patton's command decisions across 2 continents. It was not what the historians would reconstruct from the diaries and the reports and the accounts of the campaign. It was something more primary and more intimate than any of those things: the knowledge of a man's body and its rhythms, its ailments and its vanities, its requirements and its comforts, accumulated over 8 years of daily physical proximity. Carter had joined Patton's household in 1937, when Patton was a colonel at Fort Clark, Texas, and the war that would make Patton famous was still 4 years away. He had been a young man from Tuscaloosa, Alabama, one of the men the Army assigned to personal service for senior officers, and he had found himself in the orbit of a man who was, even then, before the campaigns, before the Third Army, before the legend, a force of personality that was difficult to describe and impossible to ignore. He had pressed Patton's uniforms in Texas and in Louisiana, and in North Africa and in Sicily, and in England and in France and in Belgium and in Germany. He had been wherever Patton was, which meant he had been wherever the war was. Now, here's the thing. The relationship between Patton and Carter over those 8 years was not a friendship in any conventional sense. Patton was a general, and Carter was a sergeant, and the distance that defines those two categories does not disappear because one of them polishes the other's boots. What it was, instead, was something that has no simple name. A form of trust that accumulates between two people who have shared the same physical space through extraordinary circumstances, and who have developed, through that sharing, a specific mutual dependence that is not the same as closeness in the emotional sense, but is not the same as distance either. Carter knew when Patton had not slept. He knew the days when the command weight settled into the general's body in ways that the body's posture revealed before the face did. He knew the superstitions, Patton had many, and the rituals that surrounded them were things that Carter managed with the specific discretion of someone who understood that what he was managing was private and had to stay private. He knew the moments of doubt, because doubt has physical expressions. It lives in the hand that stays on the map a moment too long, in the meal that's left unfinished, in the particular quiet that means the thinking is not resolved. Carter had watched all of this, without commentary, for 8 years, and the watching had made him the person who knew Patton most completely in the ways that are not available to history. Picture it. Not the battlefield Patton, not the speech-making Patton, the jeep-riding, horn-honking, pearl-handled pistols and profanity Patton that the accounts of the campaign preserve, but the early morning Patton, in the hour before the uniform goes on and the general assembles himself into the thing he needs to be for the day. The Patton who had a specific way of taking his coffee that Carter had been getting right for 8 years without being told it was wrong. The Patton who read his Bible in the evenings, privately, in a way that was not the public faith he performed with the prayer cards and the chaplain's medal, but something older and more personal. The Patton who worried about his men, not strategically in the way a general worries about his forces, but in the specific human way that Carter could see in the hours after the battles, when the reports were in and the casualties were on the paper. Carter had been at this, every day, for 8 years. Here's what doesn't make it into the history books. What those 8 years of daily proximity do to the understanding of a man's character. The accounts of Patton that historians have assembled are accounts made at a distance, from the documents he left, from the accounts of officers who observed him, from the records of the decisions he made and the words he said. These accounts are true. They are also made from the outside. Carter's knowledge was made from the inside, from the unreplicable position of the person who was there in all the hours that the records do not contain. He knew which parts of the public Patton were performance and which were conviction, not because Patton had told him, but because 8 years of watching the assembly and disassembly of the performance had made the distinction clear. He knew, for instance, that the famous temper was not uncontrolled. He had seen Patton control it in situations where a less disciplined man would have let it go, and he had seen Patton deploy it in situations where control would have served him better, and the pattern was not the pattern of a man who could not govern his own fury. It was the pattern of a man who understood anger as a tool and used it accordingly, and who paid for the use of it in private in ways that the tool's recipients never saw. He knew that the famous certainty, the Patton who walked into a room and made the room feel that he had already decided everything that needed deciding, was not always what it appeared to be. There were nights when the certainty was the product of discipline rather than of confidence, when Carter could see in the general's posture the specific effort of someone maintaining a surface that the interior was not fully supporting. He did not tell anyone this. He understood without being told that this was information that belonged to the privacy of the man and not to the record of the general. And this is where it gets complicated, because what Carter knew about Patton was precisely the information that the public Patton, the legend, the biography, the film, could not contain or convey. The legend of Patton is of a man who was always the thing he appeared to be: certain, aggressive, decisive, theatrical, large. The reality that Carter knew, and that Carter was one of the very few people positioned to know, was of a man who was those things in the way that any human being is what they appear to be: partially, effortfully, at a cost, with dimensions that the appearance does not reveal. Patton was large. He was also, in the hours that no one documents, a man who got tired and worried, and was not always certain, and sometimes sat in the dark after the reports were in, and did not immediately go to sleep. Carter knew this. He had been there. On December 9th, 1945, Patton was in a staff car on a road near Mannheim, Germany, going pheasant hunting with General Gay. The car collided with a military truck. Everyone else walked away. Patton was thrown forward in the back seat and fractured a cervical vertebra. By the time the medical team reached him, he was conscious, but unable to move below the neck. He had survived campaigns that killed hundreds of thousands of men, and he had been destroyed by a traffic accident on a peaceful road in the post-war winter. Stay with me, because the 12 days that followed, from December 9th to December 21st, when Patton died, are the period during which Carter's position in the story becomes entirely clear. During those 12 days, Patton was in hospital in Heidelberg, paralyzed, receiving Beatrice, his wife, who had flown from the United States to be with him. He was attended by the best medical staff available, and he was comfortable, by the accounts of those who saw him, in the specific way that a man can be comfortable who has understood that he is not going to recover. He said at some point that he could not seem to get well. He died on December 21st. Carter was not in the room at the end. The end was for family and for the people whose relationship to the dying man was defined by blood and love, in the ways that 8 years of pressing uniforms does not quite define. But he was there in the hospital, in the way that orderlies are there, present, available, managing the things that needed to be managed, in the hours that were not visiting hours, in the space between what the family occupied and what the institutional care occupied. He prepared the uniform for the last time. Think about that for a second. The uniform that Patton was buried in, the full-dress uniform of a 4-star general of the United States Army, the uniform that would be seen at the funeral, and that would be in the photographs that went to every newspaper in the country, was prepared by the hands that had been preparing it for 8 years. Carter had done this preparation hundreds of times, in dozens of locations, under every imaginable condition. He had done it in field conditions, with no iron and no facilities, and had still produced something acceptable. He had done it in formal situations, where every crease had to be perfect. He had, by December of 1945, done it so many times that the specific way Patton wore his uniform, the fall of the fabric, the position of the decorations, the particular relationship between the jacket and the posture that Patton's body had created, and that Carter knew how to reproduce, was knowledge that lived in his hands. He reproduced it one last time. Then he went to Luxembourg. The ceremony was on December 24th, 1945, Christmas Eve. There is a specific quality to a military funeral on Christmas Eve that the calendar was not trying to produce, and that the calendar produced anyway. The juxtaposition of the season of birth and light with the ceremony of final burial, the contrast between what December 24th usually means and what it meant on that afternoon in Hamm. The ground of the American military cemetery at Hamm was cold. The grave plots were aligned with the precision that military cemeteries impose on death, the markers in rows, the ground maintained, the order of the cemetery expressing the same values as the formations the buried men had once stood in. The generals were there. The dignitaries were there. Mrs. Patton was there, having already said the private goodbye that the hospital room in Heidelberg had contained. The Third Army was represented in the soldiers who stood in formation, in the men who had been under Patton's command and who were now present at his end. And at the head of the grave, at the position closest to the man being buried, was William Carter. See, what most folks don't realize is that the positioning at a military funeral is not accidental. The protocol of a ceremonial burial assigns positions according to a hierarchy, and the hierarchy is explicit. The family occupies the positions of greatest honor. The highest-ranking officers take the positions that their rank designates. The arrangement is ordered and intentional, and it says, through the physical grammar of where people stand, what the institution understands about the relationships that the death has ended. The fact that Carter stood closest means one of two things. Either the ceremony departed from the standard protocol in a way that reflected a specific understanding of who had been closest to Patton in the years of his life, or the standard protocol, in this specific case, recognized something true, that the man who had been physically nearest to Patton for 8 years, the man whose life had been organized around the general's needs and whose days had been shaped by the general's rhythm, occupied a position of proximity that the protocol of rank had no category for, but that the physical arrangement of a burial could express. He stood closest because he had always stood closest, in every room and every field and every headquarters and every campaign. He was standing in the place he had always occupied. The generals at the ceremony that day, the American and Allied officers who had known Patton as a peer, as a superior, as the commander whose operational brilliance had produced one of the most remarkable advances in the history of armored warfare, knew what they knew about Patton. They knew him in the way that the records know him, from the decisions he made, the orders he gave, the battles he won, and the ones he approached differently than his superiors wanted. They knew the general. Carter knew the man. This is not a distinction that diminishes the generals or elevates the sergeant. It is a distinction that describes what proximity produces. The generals had the kind of knowledge about Patton that institutions produce and records preserve. Carter had the kind of knowledge that cannot be preserved, that lives only in the person who accumulated it, and that is gone when that person is gone. He knew what Patton smelled like in the morning. He knew how the general's voice changed when he was tired in a way that was not the fatigue of effort, but the fatigue of grief. He knew the specific silence that followed a day when the casualty reports were particularly bad, not the strategic silence of a commander processing operational information, but the human silence of someone absorbing the weight of loss. He knew, in short, the dimensions of the man that the biography cannot contain. William Carter, Master Sergeant, Tuscaloosa, Alabama. He had been 22 years old when he entered Patton's service in 1937, which made him 30 years old at the funeral in Luxembourg. He had spent the most significant years of his life, his 20s, his young manhood, at the side of a man who was simultaneously one of the most famous figures of the 20th century, and a particular human being with particular habits and needs and fears and moments of tenderness that the fame did not reveal. He went home to Tuscaloosa after Luxembourg. He returned to the life that the 8 years of service had been built alongside, the life that had waited while he was in North Africa and Sicily and France and Belgium and Germany. He had children. He had a community. He had the specific social world of a black man in Alabama in the post-war 1940s, which was a world with its own extraordinary demands and its own extraordinary dignity. He had in that world a knowledge that no one in it could fully understand or share, because no one in it had been where he had been or seen what he had seen. He did not talk about it much. This was the pattern of the men who had served in intimate proximity to power. The knowledge was so specific, and the vocabulary for conveying it was so inadequate, that the accounts tended to compress into the kind of summary that loses most of what it is trying to describe. When he was asked, as he was sometimes asked in the years after, what General Patton had been like, he gave the answer that the question was designed to receive: a great soldier, a difficult man, someone who demanded much and gave much. The private knowledge stayed private. He had served General Patton for 8 years. He had been there when the general died. He had stood at the head of the grave in Luxembourg. That was the whole story, and it was not the whole story. The man standing closest at Patton's funeral was not a general. He was a sergeant from Alabama who had pressed the dead man's uniforms for 8 years, who had been in the rooms that history couldn't access, who had accumulated a specific and irreplaceable knowledge of the man behind the general, and who stood at the head of that grave in Luxembourg in December of 1945, because there was no other place for him to stand. The closest he had been for 8 years was the closest he would be on the last day, and then the column would move on without the general, and Carter would go back to Tuscaloosa and carry what he knew about the man the way you carry things that have no adequate form, quietly, specifically, and for as long as you live. Was it right that Carter stood closest, that the man of no rank held the position of greatest proximity at the burial of one of the most celebrated generals in American military history? Some would say this raises questions about what military protocol actually honors and what it misses, that a ceremony governed by rank will always fail to express the kinds of closeness that rank cannot measure, and that Carter's position was the ceremony correcting for one of protocol's systemic blind spots. Others would say that what Carter's position expressed was something more fundamental than protocol, that the person who serves you, daily for 8 years, in the rooms no one else enters, has earned something that rank cannot confer, and that the ceremony recognized without being able to name. That he stood closest because that was where he had always been, and because the relationship between a man and the person who attends to him, who knows his body and his habits and his private face, is one of the oldest and most intimate relationships that power produces, and that it deserved at the end to be in the position it had always occupied. Let us know in the comments below, and if you want more untold stories from World War II, make sure you subscribe.